My name is John Lim, and I'm the Executive Director of CORE and Policy Lead at the Sing Health Duke-NUS Global Health Institute. As part of a series of topical webinars that CORE is organizing on the evolving COVID-19 pandemic, our session today focuses on the issue of global regulatory coordination to facilitate access to COVID-19 diagnostics and therapeutics. It goes without saying that the world has undergone a massive change since the beginning of the year. One usually refers to 2020 vision as seeing things with great clarity, whereas the current situation in the year 2020 is anything but clear. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve as countries prepare to transition out of major lockdowns, while others are still in the midst of or imposing major restrictions. But at the same time, global scientific research into COVID-19 therapeutics has been moving forward at an unprecedented rate, with the development of COVID-19 diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines surging on at an extraordinary speed. Global coordination among national regulatory authorities is more critical than ever to approve new health products quickly, while also ensuring safety, quality, and efficacy. And this has to be followed by equitable and appropriate access to these products by populations in developed and developing health systems alike. The question is, are regulators and regulatory systems around the world ready for this? And so to help us get a better understanding of the situation, I'm delighted to welcome four distinguished and experienced friends to discuss the issues today. Let me first introduce them before we hear from them. Dr. Murray or Mac Lumpkin has been Deputy Director, Integrated Development, Regulatory Affairs, and lead global regulatory systems initiatives at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation since 2014. These initiatives are focused on working with partners such as the World Health Organization, regulatory regionalization initiatives, and national regulatory authorities to make more efficient and effective, but without sacrificing quality, efficacy, or safety, the regulatory processes through which products must pass in order to be developed, legally marketed, and overseen appropriately after marketing authorization in low and middle income countries. Mac is a physician by training and was previously at the US FDA for 24 years as Director of the Anti-Infective Drugs Division, then Deputy Center Director at CDER, and finally for 11 years as Deputy Commissioner for International Programs. We then have three heads of regulatory agencies with us today. Firstly, we have Professor Guido Razzi, who is the Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, and he's been chair of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities since October 2019. Guido was previously Director General of the Italian Medicines Agency and also a member of its management board. He's a physician with specializations in internal medicine, allergology, and clinical immunology from the University of Rome. He's also a member of CORE's advisory board, and he's been honored numerous awards with an honorary degree and has authored numerous scientific publications. Next, we have Dr. Mimi Chung, who has been Chief Executive Officer of Singapore's Health Sciences Authority since 2014 and is also a member of CORE's advisory board. As CEO of HSA, Mimi oversees HSA's wide-ranging public health responsibilities, comprising health products regulation, the National Blood Service, and the National Analytical and Forensic Sciences and Forensic Medicine Services. Mimi is a medical doctor by training, but as part of Singapore's administrative service, she's held senior positions in a range of government ministries, including health, finance, information communication and the arts, education, and home affairs. And we have then Professor John Skerritt, who is Deputy Secretary Health Products Regulation at the Australian Department of Health, Australia, and Vice Chair of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. John heads the Health Products Regulation Group, which works to safeguard and enhance the health of all Australians through effective, timely, and risk-proportionate regulation of therapeutic goods and control of drug import, export, and production. He's adjunct full professor of the Universities of Sydney, Queensland, and Canberra, and he's had extensive experience in the Australian government. So with that, I would like now to invite Dr. Lumpkin, or Mac as we call him, to start the discussion with a brief presentation from his perspectives as a former regulator and also his current international and non-governmental roles. And after this, I will invite the three heads of regulatory agencies to comment and respond. So Mac, over to you, please.
Thank you again, John. As John was saying, I was asked to spend a couple of minutes this morning trying to put in perspective some of the realities related to global regulatory cooperation in the era of COVID. And I thought I would start by thinking back to some of the more recent epidemics that we've all been involved in one way or another. And I think one of the first things we've learned with COVID is that COVID is not, in many respects, either Ebola or Zika. This is not simply a localized epidemic. This, as we all know, is a global pandemic. It has created economic problems, not just on a local level. It has created a global economic crisis. And as opposed to Zika and Ebola, we have a situation now where rich people are dying, where high-income countries are having their economies tank. And I think what we've seen, as John has pointed out, as opposed to Zika and Ebola, there is really no shortage of resources that are being thrown at this problem, either in terms of human resources, financial resources, or manufacturing resources. And as a real challenge to regulators, this is all happening simultaneously. I think for those of us that focus primarily on low-income countries, one of the things we are noticing is that this is being driven by high-income country needs and focus, and there has not been a great deal of focus on any of the specific needs of low-income countries. We also have, as opposed to Zika and Ebola, this incredible situation where we have literally the global population, billions of people living in a wrecked global economy who are demanding answers, solutions, and as John pointed out, access. And they want this yesterday. And yet we still know a great deal about this pathogen that we've learned in the past several months, but we are really still, as opposed to Ebola and Zika, at the very early stages of learning how this pathogen interacts with humans and with the larger environment. But as John pointed out, there has been tremendous progress to date. When you think about it, barely 7 months ago, any of us even knew about this, but now we have multiple diagnostics, both looking for antigen and looking for antibody of various ilks and various validation stages being used in millions of people to make personal health decisions and national health decisions. We have multiple clinical trials underway, looking at small molecules, looking at biologics, looking at repurposed drugs, drugs that were in mid-development, and new drugs, looking at how we might prophylax people, either pre-exposure or post-exposure. How do we treat them when they are outside the hospital, when they're in the hospital? Within 7 months, we remarkably have several vaccines that are already in phase 2. And we have monoclonal antibody studies and plasma-derived antibody studies that are underway. Again, this is because there have been massive economic and human resources that have been thrown at this, trying to find a solution and hoping that at least one of these shots on goal will actually score. And I think what we see is that the world has become a series of test kitchens, both in terms of countermeasure development and in how we deploy various temporizing measures like social distancing while we await the magic answer. And so the question for people today that we're going to be talking about is, in the midst of all of this activity, how do regulators and the community of regulators fit into this? And how can they assure that they and the products they regulate are really an integral part of the solution and not part of the program? I think what I was saying as regulators, one of the things that we have learned is that without interpretable data, the work of the first responders is really very severely hampered. And though there's tremendous pressure to have a diagnostic, to have a treatment, to have a vaccine, I think we've learned many times in the past that the only thing worse than having no treatment or no diagnostic is having a bad treatment or having a bad diagnostic. And that's where regulators come in. It's where regulators come in the normal course of business, but even more so in emergencies. Regulators, as we know, are primarily there to assure that the data about needed treatments are science-based, are transparent and reliable, and they're there to help try to determine, along with their community, if these data are applicable to their healthcare system and to their populations. In emergencies, I think we all know and we're seeing that regulators have to be agile in how they work within their own jurisdictions and how they work together. And they have to use their emergency authorities transparently and confidently. Now, when we talk about being agile, when we talk about emergency pathways, we're not talking about cutting corners scientifically, but minimizing redundancy, minimizing time loss, while we're maximizing the use of our constrained resources in areas that are indeed value added and impactful, and that we realize that we in the community have to make risk-based decisions in the context of the pandemic. And that is often a very different risk-based calculus than we see in the normal setting. I think because the epicenter of the disease at this point in time is both in Europe and North America, we're seeing tremendous pressure on the world's largest NRAs, the EMA and the US FDA, to take urgent, informed, and contextually risk-based decisions. And we've seen clinical trial applications being processed extremely rapidly. We've seen emergency use authorizations, not only in diagnostics, but also in therapeutics. We've seen people dealing with the issue of site inspections when we are in a global lockdown, and how we're going to continue to learn after these products are used, both in clinical trials and under emergency use authorizations, with these post-authorization commitments. But I think, while this is being driven by EMA and FDA because the epicenters are in those jurisdictions, what we're seeing in a lot of the areas that I focus on is this is creating increasing pressure for similar actions in other countries, and especially countries whose regulations and their regulatory authorities are significantly under-resourced without specific emergency procedures, either for clinical trial authorization or for marketing authorizations. And as John pointed out, once these countermeasures become available, there is going to be an immediate global demand for equitable access, both in terms of cost and in terms of time, to whatever is considered to be the magic bullet at that point in time. And this is where the very critical issue of capacity is coming in, and the reality that no manufacturer has the capacity to service the world at this time. So I think what we're seeing in the low-income countries is this question of, okay, what version of this product am I going to receive? And what are the regulatory implications if the version I receive is not the version that the EMA or the FDA or the TGA or the HSA looked at? And so this webinar is really looking at how regulators can work together. And this, John, is really my next to last slide here, because I wanted to put this up as a visual for us to think about as we go today. And I think we realize that we don't just have one product. This is not a situation where we are waiting for a new, novel, innovative product to come through. That might be part of the solution, but we also have already registered products that are being looked at to see whether they might work in COVID. We have products that were already in development about which we know a great deal that are now being repurposed to look at how they work in COVID. And I think we realize that as the pandemic moves around the globe and as the different jurisdictions are successful or not successful in flattening the curve and then bringing this round of the disease under control, the regulatory tolerance and the community tolerance for these contextually related risk-based decisions is going to be different. in different parts of the world. So I think, again, that's another reality that comes into the decision making by regulators. What I wanted to point out here, and I hope you can see my little cursor here, I think if we look in the world of clinical development, as John was pointing out, we've seen a lot of regulatory cooperation already. You'll hear a little bit more later from John and Guido on ICMA. But I think what those of us on the outside are seeing is that there is some generalizable information coming out of this. But I think we also realize that we're very early in our knowledge here, and there are a lot of product-specific discussions that are going on with regulators that are confidential. But I think as more and more learning happens, that as there are more generalizable themes that come out, the larger community is waiting with bated breath to hear what the regulators using for like ICMA are coming up with. There are WHO-led regional discussions that are going on a routine basis. AVAREF, as the Pan-African Clinical Trials group that looks at clinical trials in Africa from both a regulatory perspective and a ethics board perspective, has their emergency procedure up and running and are ready now as the disease finds itself spreading in Africa, and as people are becoming more interested in clinical trials in Africa there. I think with the WHO Solidarity trials, we're seeing regulators coming together, and we're learning on the outside, based on those trials, what people are thinking about in terms of trial designs, endpoints, and analyses. But there's still pending questions that be interesting to see if we can get into some thoughts later today, such as what will be the basis for a vaccine early authorization? Are people going to be okay with animal data, human safety data, and immunogenicity data when we don't have any clinical correlates of protection? Or are we going to have to wait until we actually do have the clinical correlates of protection? I think as you look and think more about the registration piece, what we're seeing already, and I think what we will continue to see, is that first registrations, whether they are emergency or full, will be done in the high-income countries. And then it is a question about subsequent country registration, whether that's another high-income country or whether these are low-income countries, and what the relationship will be between what happens in the subsequent countries and the first country. We know there are relationships that exist between many countries that will facilitate that. But when we're starting to think about the low-income countries, I think we get back into this issue of how much can they use reliance to rely upon what happened in the first registration? Will they be okay with an emergency authorization, or will they wait for a full authorization? And as I mentioned earlier, the most important question will be, is the version of the product they're going to get the same version of the product that was registered in the first country? There are also other players in this that we need to remember as we talk about this, and that is the procurers have their requirements. Are they going to be willing to purchase these products based only on an emergency authorization? Will they need some kind of a utilization policy statement from WHO or from the ECDC, from the US CDC, from others who make recommendations on whether these products should or should not be used and how they should be used? And so just a final point here, not only have we talked about reliance and version of product issue, it's the need for unredacted reports when we're talking about reliance. Countries that want to rely on the work of those whom they trust need to have reports that they can read and read in their entirety in order to make their decisions. They need to be brought into discussions as early as possible, because there will be issues in these low-income countries about whether what happens in the high-income countries are really applicable to their populations. What happens when you have a high incidence of HIV or TB or malaria or malnutrition, all of which we know affect the immune system? What types of studies will we need to really try to correlate what happens in the high-income countries with the experience that we are beginning to see in the low-income countries? So with that, John, I want to turn it back over to you. I hope that sets up some issues about where I think we've seen regulatory cooperation actually work quite well so far, and I hope some of the challenges in regulatory cooperation as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mac, for giving us a great overview of the situation and the issues, and also these questions you've listed, which are things I hope we'll come back to in the course of the discussion. So perhaps I could begin by asking Guido to respond to what you've heard Mac say, but could you also perhaps say a little bit about ICMRA, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, because I'm not sure that the audience would necessarily be familiar with it. And also, how does it work with WHO, and also these issues of reliance that Mac has raised in his presentation. So over to you, Guido.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the introduction. That is very well framing of I'm trying to say now, and also thank you, Mac, because certainly you are facilitating my explanation of what you might want to see, to listen. I understand that basically there is a need to have a rapid managing of the authorization, managing of the evidence that is coming, and authorization of new treatment, new drug, and new hope for this COVID. There is a need for that to be robust and to generate the right evidence. And I understand that one of the important things, already I'm seeing some questions coming in, an harmonized way, an harmonization, a cooperation between different authorities and in different parts of the globe. Let's briefly come to the first 2 points to explain about the harmonization and the interaction, what the ICMA, the Coalition of Medicines Authorities, is, and the interaction with WHO. About RAPID, of course, we try to have in place some very efficient way to assess and evaluate the evidence that is submitted, the data that are coming. And John, you very nicely introduced how, and also Mac have also really already addressed how little we know about this new disease. We are discovering every day different mechanisms. We started to think that was prevalently the virus causing the problem. Then we know that in the late phase there is a lot of inflammation, and the mechanism to attack with an antiviral mechanism probably is not as efficient as we want. And now we are discovering that there is probably a coagulopathy on top of this. This, of course, for a regulator matters a lot, because the proof of concept, the underlying mechanism, and all this knowledge can facilitate and can definitely help to take decision with less data, which is exactly what we are asked to do in this kind of situation in emergency. So everybody expects we take a swift response, and equally they want to be reassured that it's robust enough. About robustness, as said, I discovered from that artificial intelligence detected 50,000 trials going on. This is the least thing that we like to happen. We had certainly would prefer 100 of very well run the trials to generate appropriate evidence, more robust evidence. If that would have been happening, we would be in a much better situation, maybe already 1 month ago, given the huge number of patients that unfortunately were available for clinical trial. We would have now a much better and robust evidence. And here it comes in the collaboration with other regulators. That is essential since, as you already pointed out, the pandemic is moving in different parts in the globe in waves. It is occurring everything at the same time, but not at the same intensity. And so the availability of peaks of patients, of different stage of patients, is moving fast. And this fragmentation is, of course, generating a lot of problems. And already answering one of the questions, certainly the data that has been used last week for the emergency approval in US and the next day in Japan are probably, hopefully, will be complemented with additional data this week when it's likely that the EMA will be taking a decision. So this is the nature of what we are going. So what we are discussing, and I come to the harmonization. We are basically discussing all these kind of things. We have, under the coalition, we have a bi-weekly meeting where we have 2 pillars. One, we share best practice, and one, we share the policies. So which policy we are adopting to enable ourselves to take a decision in the scenario that I briefly described, and that was already quite well described by John and Mac. So, and what is the coalition? The coalition is the coalition of the willingness. It entails many tens of authorities around the world. Is governed by an executive committee composed by 1 chair, currently under EMA, and 2 vice chair. One is our friend John Scale, that will be talking soon after. And I certainly, John, you will complementing all what I will be missing to say. And the other vice chair is Japan. Under this governance, we try to identify the burning issues around the world. We try to identify the best practice. We try to identify the needs in many areas of any part of the globe. And we try to discuss what matters and what are the common elements that regulator shares. And we try to see if there is some common line, if we can support each other in some difficult political environment we might experience over the time in different time in different regions. And one of the most important things, we are trying to issue common communication, common statement, and this is of course pretty much intensified in these days. On top of this, we are, for the COVID, we already organized 2 seminars. These are open to all the authorities worldwide. And I come to WHO. WHO is an observer and can join our meetings anytime to try to take stock of what is ongoing in terms of basically the seminar were one on the treatments, the possible treatment, and the second, of course, specific on vaccines. And you mentioned vaccines. Well, vaccines are, of course, as you say, there are 110 vaccines to the best of my knowledge. Maybe meanwhile we are talking 111. And many of them are phase 2. And here the debate that is ongoing, and here we are also using some privileged channels of communication, like the confidentiality agreement we enjoy with many authorities. we try to see what is the design we can accept, what will be the design that will provide us with sufficient amount of evidence and reassurance to an approval, and also to see if there are some surrogate endpoint we can accept, we can use, and that certainly we can speed up any possible decision. Final, at EMA, we have started this rolling review, trying to go down from 210 days of the normal approval, 150 for the exceptional approval, down to 14 days for the normal approval. Now, if we submitted a sufficient amount of evidence, we can go down to 48 hours. Is 24/7. The expert team can be summoned, and they are able, if the evidence is robust enough, 48 hours to issue a decision. I think I stop here. Very happy to take questions. I hope I already replied to one that came in writing. And over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Guido. I'd like now to ask Dr. Mimi Chung, to make some comments, and perhaps also could you address some of the questions that came in earlier in terms of Southeast Asia. There was a question that came through on how can ASEAN joint assessment play a role in helping developing countries in this region. But I think in terms of the way HSA would handle the data, and Singapore is also part of ICMRA, perhaps you could also pick up some of these questions in terms of how countries in other parts of the world can ride on decisions made by the more mature regulators, let's say in the US FDA, and the European Medicines Agency. So over to you, Mimi, please.
Thanks very much, John, for organizing this very timely webinar on the work of regulators as well as international global coordination. And also for inviting me to speak as a panelist. I'd just like to highlight that this particular pandemic has actually brought about a global health and socio-economic crisis that I think most of us would never have imagined possible in our lifetimes. And this is not even for countries with very good pandemic preparedness plans. The speed with which this virus has spread worldwide and its impact is really unprecedented. About 100 years ago, we had the 1918 Spanish flu, and it sort of, infected about 500 million people and killed some 50 million. And quite clearly today, all of us must work together to ensure a much better global health outcome for everyone during this particular pandemic. So now let me just share my perspectives on the topics and try to incorporate some of the points that John has highlighted. I hope that Singapore and HSA's experience can be helpful, particularly to the smaller regulators and the Asian ones. So just as a background, as a major international travel hub, Singapore was actually among the first countries to be hit. We had our very first patient, an imported case, on the 23rd of January. And this had to trigger a very strong whole of government response. HSA, being part of the Ministry of Health family, contributes to this whole of government response through our regulatory role. And I want to stress here that because Singapore was among the very first few countries to be hit with cases, HSA knew immediately that we had to chart our own regulatory path forward because we didn't really have the luxury of others to actually follow. Now, we also knew straight away that as SARS-CoV-2 is a novel virus, the new diagnostic tests, therapeutics, and vaccines would be needed. So even though we already adopt a risk-based, least burdensome regulatory approach to ensure the safety, the quality, the efficacy of health products in Singapore, we also knew that we would have to make our regulatory decisions in a pandemic very much more quickly and often with a lot less data, a lot more uncertainty. We also had to exercise a whole lot more regulatory innovation and flexibility so that we could ensure timely access. Let me just give you some examples to illustrate the benefit risk analysis that we actually had to do, the fine balancing act. We all know that testing strategy and capacity are really critical to quickly identifying, isolating, and treating patients, and also tracing and quarantining their close contacts. So HSA sat back and thought through a provisional authorization process in late January. This was to expedite the availability of diagnostic tests needed by Singapore. We issue our provisional authorization using a risk-based review process. It takes into consideration the design aspects of the test and the validation data to support the test is fit for purpose. We actually evaluate that the tests have reasonably met the essential safety and performance requirements for the intended purpose. And we also demand periodic monitoring and reporting by the companies to us about their test performance, also any inaccurate results because these are critical, and also the ability of these tests to detect any new published viral sequences. I mean, if you think about it, we can't afford to have too many false negatives or false positives because there are quite severe downstream consequences to healthcare and the patients. So while provisional authorization is actually meant for our domestic market, actually many companies have shared with us that there are quite a few countries, such as the Philippines, that actually are prepared to allow these tests to be marketed in their own countries using our provisional authorization. And to date, we've issued 33 such authorizations, and the range of tests include molecular diagnostic tests, including automated systems, automated immunoassay systems, and also rapid serology tests to detect antibodies. But I must also stress that actually we do not approve all tests sent to us. We've also rejected quite a few because we do need to ensure that the standards are maintained, not just for our domestic market, but because these are actually being allowed into other countries as well. So in terms of, you're talking about the Asean joint assessment, of course that is possible and can be helpful. I think the challenge though is that because there are different contexts and political considerations, there will of course be a need to take a lot more effort to attempt to coordinate across the various countries, all of which have different experiences with the pandemic and the patients and mortality rates to date. I also wanted to stress that what is actually important is also to provide a lot more pre-market consultations and to speed up priority review for industry stakeholders. In Singapore, we've done that. We've actually also facilitated many new entrants, setting up new manufacturing facilities, including those using 3D printing and injection molding. And the bottom line is all these regulatory initiatives in any country, including HSA, is meant to really help ensure adequate supplies of products that are essential during the pandemic. I mean, even at the very beginning, most of our countries experience a near immediate shortage, right, of surgical masks, thermometers, PPEs, hand sanitizers, and how regulators responded actually can result in either greater trust in the regulator or provide a negative impression of regulators. I come now to the fact that I would like to share a little bit about global regulatory coordination. And this is most crucial in the next frontier, which is actually the approving of effective therapeutics and vaccines to treat seriously ill patients, as well as vaccines to protect the entire population from COVID-19. But in discharging this responsibility, I think Matt did refer to, are we part of the solution or part of the problem? And I think that sometimes this question arises and there is some tension between regulators and industry and possibly other researchers, principally because they may misunderstand our desire, our need for very strong and robust scientific and regulatory data. So for example, for clinical trials, we really want to see the gold standard, right? Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled multi-center trials. Because really, this is the optimal way for all of us throughout the world to get the most robust scientific evidence on the safety and effectiveness of the various therapeutic and vaccine candidates. Now, to date, I know there are already more than 1,000 such studies, including more than 600 interventional studies and randomized clinical trials. And of course, we also know that some are better designed than others. Nonetheless, findings are emerging from all of these studies at a speed, at a volume, that's really very hard for any one regulator alone to be able to digest, assess, and manage very responsively. So clearly, it makes good sense for global cooperation. Then regulators can really provide more timely and sound scientific and regulatory advice to companies and investigators. We can also track and analyze the data on quality, safety, efficacy from the growing number of trials worldwide more quickly. And finally, it also helps us make much more timely marketing authorization decisions that are needed by our governments and our populations. Now, as a medium-sized regulator, HSA is clearly very stretched in order to try to ensure the continuity of supplies of essential medical products and the development of effective ones to battle COVID-19. So as all regulators share the same goals, it's really very sensible, very pragmatic for all of us to step up our strategic global cooperation. There are already many existing international cooperation platforms. For HSA, I just want to highlight the 3 key ones that we are participating very actively in during this pandemic: WHO, ICMRA, and Access. WHO is clear, right? They are the international organization best placed to coordinate the global pandemic response. ICMRA, I think Guido has already shared about, so I won't say any more about it. Just to highlight the Access Consortium. The key here is that it goes beyond info sharing to work sharing for marketing authorization. So companies can actually benefit from jointly filing just the one dossier to the 4 regulators in Australia, Canada, Singapore, and Switzerland, and receiving a consolidated set of questions to respond to. And of course, it's also helpful because it raises the productivity of the 4 regulators and helps us to speed up the overall process. Just to end by comments about equitable access, I think this is clearly going to be a challenge because of limited production capacity of manufacturers. So like, for example, if there is an effective vaccine, it's definitely going to take quite a while to produce sufficient doses to cover a global population of 7.8 billion people. Clearly, greater global cooperation is required to address the multitude of concerns here. And last but not least, I agree with the point that robust post-marketing surveillance is essential to detect safety concerns quickly. And this is because, as I shared earlier, I think many regulators are, in fact, approving products on less stringent or limited safety and efficacy data. So the post-market aspect is critical. So with that, thank you. I end my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Also, what I'm hearing, I think, as you were speaking, was that when we think of reliance, of course, it does behoove developed regulators to share the information, but other regulators in low and middle income country settings and developing settings also need to get their systems in place to be able to be part of this cooperative, collaborative effort of information sharing. I'd now like to ask John Skerritt from Australia to share his thoughts, but also perhaps could you address two other points? There's a question, what is the role of industry in facilitating the efforts of regulators? And because the EMA doesn't look at medicines, but the TGA and HSA do, could you say a bit more about diagnostics and test kits as well in your remarks? Over to you, John.
Thank you. Well, industry, I think, has many roles. They're obviously the source of innovation, but they also continue to challenge us, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But we've found throughout the couple of months of working with COVID, the last 3 months, often they've come and said, well, why can't we do something a certain way? And we sit back and we think, well, there is no more risk with that. And whether it's a disinfectant or a hand sanitizer or a different formulation of a medicine, industry, I think, has played a very positive role in challenging. Now, there are times where we say, well, no, if you do this, your manufacturing variability will be too great. But it's really important because so much of the effort has been really from them that will get the new medicines and devices, that they feel comfortable in asking those questions and challenging the regulator. I will talk a little bit about devices and tests shortly, but we've been a lucky country in many ways so far. We have only a statistic of 4 deaths per million, and that's cast against 250 to 500 deaths per million in some countries in Europe and the US. And the irony, of course, of having had such a low hospitalisation rate, we now have under 20 people in intensive care in Australia, thank God, is that we're a less attractive destination for clinical trials. And so many of the innovations that have even come from within Australian organisations, industry, research organisations, are actually now being tested on a global level. So some of those innovations, apart from the vaccines, are things such as use of convalescent immunoglobulin as a therapeutic, not just as a raw serum product, but also as a therapeutic. Use of old products, such as a BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, and things like nebulized heparin as therapies. But to go back to the beginning, we were in a fortunate position because we already had recently brought in a range of priority and provisional pathways, which expedited review, evaluation of new therapies, medicines and vaccines, and also for diagnostics. That wasn't to say that we also, in the same way that Singapore did and Europe did, had to dramatically speed our review of diagnostics and of certain products. Now, part of Australia's success in flattening the curve, to use that phrase, it has actually been nimble regulation. So we brought in a few emergency authorisations. We're actually the first country in the world to have an emergency authorisation for remdesivir. We also had similar emergency authorisations, but may or may not be used in clinical practice for things like hydroxychloroquine, brought in very early in the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also were able to be nimble enough in our review of products such as point of care and PCR tests for COVID-19, that we could give them a regulatory approval within 48 hours, but subject to conditions where working with some of the major laboratories in the country would be post-market validation steps. And then the conditions of use of those tests, the conditions under which they should be used, can be better defined as we learn more about the product. So, for example, we have approved about 20 to 25 point of care serological tests But now we know through their conditions of use that they're not suitable for the acute diagnosis of a disease, and we're still learning about the best situation in which they may be used for follow-up of infection after 2 or 3 weeks, where the antibodies do seem to appear in more than 80% of individuals. To support the social parts of the COVID response, social distancing, cleanliness, hand washing, and so forth, we also paid a lot of attention to expediting the approval of hand sanitizers, using simpler recipes that were exempt from regulatory approval. Also, we overhauled the approval of disinfectants and enabled the introduction of some new over-the-counter medicines. Now, they had supporting roles in limiting spread. Maybe it's not as exciting or as elegant an area of regulation or therapeutics as new vaccines or new prescription medicines, but we do believe the impact of things like disinfectants and effective hand sanitizers, even based on old-fashioned recipes, should not be overestimated. We also developed standards whereby even something as complex as a ventilator could be developed by research and engineering organizations, and as long as they kept to a set of published standards, they did not need to go through extensive medical device approval. So the idea was to provide a standard, make it either set out in law or in a similar form, where if they followed the exact standard, it did not need to go through the full regulatory review, but we still kept the powers of post-market monitoring. And others have mentioned how important that will be, as we've all approved both devices, diagnostics, and therapies in lightning short time. One thing that others have not mentioned is the importance of regulators in managing medicine shortages. There's been a number of medicine shortages which may not directly have been caused by the virus. They could have been caused by the secondary effect of our airline routes closing down, given that 85% of freight in many countries, including ours, is carried in the belly of passenger planes. And so having to carefully manage medicine shortages, look at alternatives, work with clinical groups on therapeutic alternatives, look at even what the appropriate dosage for things like propofol is in intensive care, has been an absolutely important part of managing our way through the COVID epidemic. Finally, I think there is a sobering lesson to learn from the experiences we've had with malaria and with HIV. I remember as a young postdoctoral fellow in late 1982 in the United States, when this new thing called AIDS was suddenly appearing, that there was a view that, don't worry, we'll have effective medicines and vaccines within a year or two. Now, I hope that with such a much bigger global effort and where we are scientifically and in our communications these days, that we're much more nimble and, more importantly, much more successful. But I think it will be important for regulators to have a holistic approach to management of a pandemic disease, because we may be in a world where we have medicines that are not fully successful in eliminating the disease. We may have medicines that reduce the duration of symptoms or reduce the duration of infection but do not eliminate infections. We may struggle to find a vaccine as quickly as we'd like, or it may be like the seasonal vaccine where vaccinations are required annually because of strain changes or because of incomplete coverage. And in those cases, the broad spectrum of diagnostics, things like disinfectants, things like even hand sanitizers, low tech, will be important. And finally, we've talked about a range of mechanisms of regulatory cooperation, and they're all critical. We also are committed to working with the region through a program we have with Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands, where we've been working together on medicines for malaria and other conditions, and we're currently, not surprisingly, extending that to regulatory collaboration on COVID-19 medicines. So once again, thanks to CORE for organising this webinar. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much, John. just for the information of the audience, the panelists have agreed to go 10 minutes beyond the hour. So we have about 15 minutes more to address some of the questions you've sent in. And perhaps I can swing it back to Guido at this point, because several questions have come through both earlier on and in the current Q&A, where people are trying to understand a bit more specifically how, in fact, the information is shared amongst regulatory authorities, whether through ICMRA, WHO. Could you say a bit more about the specifics of what is or is not shared? And I think Mac, in his earlier opening statements, had suggested that, in fact, this issue of confidentiality ought to be treated quite differently in this pandemic situation. So Guido, could you perhaps respond? And then I'll also ask Mimi and John to comment as well.
Yeah, thank you, John. From my side, I can tell you that there is clearly a big difference between what we are doing and what is our dream altogether. I'm sure I'm sharing with John and Mimi and all my colleagues to have a pandemic, like say, waiver for sharing in a much more linear way. So far, everything is happening on what is the existing confidentiality agreement, which we enjoy with many authorities, not all of them. However, the keenness of each authority to share more in the pandemic seems to be very high. As I said, we have these now bi-weekly meetings. Last time, I think we were 28 authorities around the world, if I'm not mistaken. And really, we are sharing all the methodology. We have now a format where we write down our policy, what we are doing, the methodology, everything that is just at the edge of confidentiality, but it's certainly helpful to see who is doing what and which approach is taking. And of course, there is a lot of work, personal work. This coalition, this ICMRA, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, has been able to really put together not only at the level of heads of agency, but a lot of people in personal contact. And this personal trust is certainly facilitated to reach the age of the confidentiality that we are sharing. I saw also there is one question specifically if there is a work sharing. No, unfortunately not. And that is the next step we should and we need to reach. And I see John nodding, and it's something we shared already in the past. We really need to reach that point. And if WHO and other authorities are able to foster this, that will be the level that is needed in a situation like this. Over.
Thank you, Guido. Mimi and John, do you have any things to add to what Guido has just said? Mimi first.
Just some quick comments. I support the observations that Guido has made. From HSA's perspective, there appear to be two perhaps major impediments. One is actually the legal frameworks under which the regulators in the various countries are working. And there are sometimes feedback that either it precludes info or work sharing, or even for info sharing, confidentiality agreements are required. And as we all know, it takes time to come up with these CAs. So in a pandemic, if perhaps some of these CAs could be facilitated much faster, it would certainly be very helpful. And I think the second one is cultural. It is the regulators themselves building certain bonds of trust and comfort level with one another. And that, I think, only comes about through a lot more interaction. Hopefully, because there is this sense of urgency, not crisis, during this pandemic, when all of us are very, very stretched with a lot of information that is still lacking and needs to be obtained fairly quickly across many regulators, this familiarity and cultural ease of working together will come about more quickly. Thanks.
Thank you. John, any comments?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we don't waste a good crisis here. And in the same way that our staff, for example, those who are reviewing PCR tests and other in vitro diagnostics have done, frankly, in 48 hours as a team, working 3 or 4 months as an individual, there's a new sense of pragmatism. And that same pragmatism, I'm hoping, will actually extend to greater trust in other regulators. Yes, we realise that the products may vary slightly between sites, different manufacturing sites and so forth. But I do think that, and Guido has used the example of the 2-weekly, fortnightly teleconference, that we can really use this to realise that we don't want to make the same decision 20 times. It can be so much more powerful if we can share information. In fact, the other thing that will make us share information was also alluded to by Guido. We have every country often setting up small clinical trials. There's a few global ones with multiple sites, but we literally have dozens or hundreds perhaps of clinical trials of many of these agents going on. And we're going to have to find a way to, in a statistically robust way, bring all that data together. And that's another thing that will drive regulatory collaboration.
Thanks, John. Mac, do you have any thoughts to add on from what you've heard so far?
Yeah, John, I would just add that I think, as John Scarrett has said, pragmatism has driven a lot of this. And I think we've seen in low-income countries, because they are so resource constrained, that even prior to the pandemic, the reality was they had to get to work sharing. They had to get to regional approaches to things simply because they didn't have enough resources to get there. And I think we look at the concept of work sharing really kind of in 2 ways. One is actually sitting down together and doing the work together, such as a joint assessment, which we see in AVRF, we see in Zazibona, we see in a lot of the regional approaches to market authorization or clinical trial authorization. But also, as I was mentioning earlier, reliance is a form of work sharing. I mean, it is using the work product of another and having confidence that you understand why they did what they did, what they did, what they did. But again, this is not recognition, it is reliance. You then have to decide for yourself, for your population, using your laws, what is your regulatory decision. But you don't have to repeat the scientific assessment. You don't have to repeat the inspection. And I think that is what we're seeing. One thing that I hope that, will be wider because of the pandemic, and one of the perhaps good things coming out of it is exactly what we have here today. How easy it was for 507 of us to get in the same room and have a discussion. Nobody had to fly, nobody had to get a visa, there was no jet lag. And we're seeing that, interestingly, in Africa already, that being forced to do virtual meetings is actually easier to a degree. Again, because people are not having to get visas. You're not having to schedule the meeting weeks and weeks in advance. And so I'm hoping that one of the learnings out of this, as John says, that we don't waste a good crisis, is that we've all learned somewhat how to do this technology. We've learned that we can do our business through this technology, and perhaps we can do our business more efficiently and actually bring more people together into the decision-making process than we've ever been able to do before. Thanks.
Thanks, Mac. Can I pose a slightly more technical question on benefit risk profiles, because several questions came through earlier. And Guido, you had mentioned that, of course, you don't deviate very much from the requirements for data and information before making decisions, even when you speed up the processes. But for example, for vaccines, I noticed in the ICMRA report, there was a concern about vaccine-induced disease enhancement, and a question came through, would regulators be willing to accept challenge studies? Could you make a comment on this?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, I think that can be very helpful in various parts of the vaccine development process, and would provide us useful information to speed up regulatory appraisal or investigation of vaccine. However, of course, it is vital that these studies are conducted in a very ethical and acceptable fashion, and also to provide not only volunteers, but also the professionals looking after them with a maximum protection against any harm of infection, including possible long-term consequences. Of course, EMA is very open to discuss the study design, but that is fundamental. And we have to remind, unfortunately, that the previous vaccine on some other SARS virus, unfortunately, was increasing the severity of the disease at the beginning. And that's why even we're really open to explore the clinical trial design for the challenge, but with this in mind, with some cautiousness and some protection around the people who are undergoing the challenge.
Thank you. And would Australia and Singapore have similar approaches and on this issue? John?
It would be hard for us ethically to challenge people. We don't have a ban on it, and like Guido, we would discuss trial design with the proponents. The challenge we have is that we still don't know much about the serological response in this condition. So I don't think it would be adequate for us to say, well, if you're able to affect the antibody response, for serum antibody response, then you're going to have an effective vaccine, because we've already shown that the response seems to be, whether it's measured by ELISA or immunochromatography, it's quite a delayed response in many patients, and there are some individuals who may not even form detectable antibodies at all, and most seem to take at least 2 to 3 weeks. So the role of humoral immunity, both in protection from a disease and as a proxy for vaccine efficacy, is certainly unknown. And so I think even if we can't do challenge studies, sadly, we're going to be needing to check vaccines in communities where there is still quite a high background level of disease.
Thank you. And then, but perhaps to round off, and I will ask Mimi to start first and then work my way through Guido, John, and back to Mac to round us off. Just looking forward, a question came through at the very beginning. How do you think, and you've alluded to this to some degree along the way, how do you think the whole global regulatory landscape will be changed by COVID-19? And John was saying, don't waste a good crisis, but what changes do you think will actually come out of this, especially in terms of the issue today of how do we facilitate access, not just now, but for other issues and crises going forward? So Mimi, could I invite you to share your final thoughts on this? Over to you, Mimi.
Thanks, John. I fully agree with the other John Skerritt, that we should not waste a good crisis. I think that whether we want to or not, whether we like to or not, all of us are going to have to learn to cooperate much more widely and deeply. And basically, I do think that as such cooperation will engender familiarity across the staff, it would also build up a lot more comfort and trust over time. So I think the big question that arises to me is, will we go back to what was the previous normal? I'm actually hoping that the answer is no, because the new normal that we all work together so hard to create would hopefully be a better one, and all of us will retain the status quo, including perhaps that a lot of work can now be done via remote sessions such as this, as opposed to trying to fly everyone to a particular venue for discussions alone. Yeah. I just also wanted to say that apart from regulators doing our work effectively together, we need to ensure that all of us are very clear about the need to retain trust levels with our populations. So I think I cannot stress enough that good, coherent, clear communications, minus a lot of scientific and technical jargon, would actually be critical so that our populations can well understand the regulatory positions that we are taking and know that we are all working in their best interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Guido, your final comments, please. Where are we going from here?
Well, I think from here we are going to certainly explore a way to be more prepared, pretty much in the same direction that Mimi said. And I would say in Europe there is an unexpected demand from many countries to have a more centralized approach, more coordinated approach. And I think this spirit will be expanded beyond Europe.
Thank you. What's the Australian perspective, John?
Well, I think similar to what Guido said, I think we will have more consistent standards globally, but regulators will be less inclined to have their own different way of reviewing whether a trial is suitable or unsuitable. On the other hand, I think our staff and globally will also become more flexible in having to look at different data sources. You get what you get often in these situations, and it may well be that the first medicines are approved from observational rather than good old-fashioned randomized blinded clinical trials. I think the other thing that will come is strengthened regulatory public health cooperation. Regulators for many years have often been seen as isolated from the mainstream of public health, and I think what we're all proving ourselves to be, and will continue to prove ourselves to be, even after the peak of infections and deaths has gladly passed, will be that our work in looking at medicines, vaccines, will have a longer tail on it. And the strength of collaboration between regulators and public health officials will need to continue.
Thanks very much, John. Mac, the last word to you.
Thanks, John. I think particularly looking at this from a low-income country regulator perspective, and for one of these a high income, there are three things. I think, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that working virtually is going to become much more the norm than it has in the past, because we've done the ultimate beta test and have found out that it is possible to do. I think also the issue of the regulatory challenges and the market challenges of having different versions of a product circulating is going to now be in the forefront, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, given the capacity and the need in this pandemic, we are going to see multiple versions of products and are going to have to deal with that. And finally, I think we're all going to have to deal with the issue of people are going to ask, if we can do this and we can speed things up for COVID, why can't we do it for other serious and life-threatening illnesses? And we all know there are many nuances and many caveats to that answer. But I think we're going to have to be ready to answer it, because people in those communities are going to say, you know, if you can do it for them, why can't you do it for us? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mac. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their inputs today. I know Guido has to run off very soon, but I suppose my main sort of observation and takeaway is that just as the whole research and development field has been ramping up considerably, in fact, regulation hasn't stayed static either. And I think from what has happened in the last few years to the development of ICMRA working with WHO, of course, people will always expect things to move faster, to collaborate further. But in fact, what I'm seeing is a lot more coordination and collaboration than there used to be. And in fact, I think, as John Skerritt was saying, in fact, I think people are not really letting this crisis go. I mean, it's a life and death situation for sure. And I do see the regulators around the world responding. So watch this space. A lot more will be developing. Certainly, we're not out of the woods yet, and there may be further waves of the pandemic coming. So I think everyone is still in it together and addressing the issues from the regulatory front to support the access of therapeutics, vaccines to our populations. But thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to further sessions, and we also wish the regulators well, because you have a tremendous task ahead of you. And we know you're highly under-resourced in many respects, but thank you very much for working together globally to address these authorization and access issues. So with that, thank you very much and goodbye, and have a good day ahead. Bye-bye.